Welcome back. Today's story filled with drama and unexpected turns. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump in.
Jason sits on the couch, watching the gentle light from the fireplace. He holds a glass of brandy. It's New Year's Eve, and he can hear Emily humming a song while she arranges the holiday gifts. Even though their kids are nearly grown up, they still celebrate Santa on Christmas morning. Instead of toys, they give sweaters, books, gadgets, and candles, all with the same love they always show. Jason glances at Emily, and she looks back at him. Their eyes meet, and they smile at each other with enduring love. I think back to an earlier New Year's Eve, many years ago, and to one just a few years before that, when a series of circumstances, both fortunate and unfortunate, led Claire to become my lover and soon thereafter my wife. They say you sometimes have to go through hell to get to heaven, and that was true in my case. I went through a hell I wouldn't wish on any man, but if I hadn't, I wouldn't have Claire, and I wouldn't be half the man I am today. Let me tell you my story because there are lessons to be learned from it. To the best of my knowledge, in the history of the world, there has only been one perfect man, and even he was quite a bit more than just a man. So it stands to reason that every one of us, at some point in our lives, has done something bad, something that hurts someone else. We've all done something that should have earned us condemnation, at least from the higher powers. And it is because of grace that we don't pay the penalty for our often foolish decisions. In my case, I took someone who was at least drug-free and started her on the path to addiction. I introduced Rachel Morgan to marijuana when we were just out of high school, and from that one corrupting moment, she slowly descended into the world of addicts and crime. It might not have been so bad, except that not long after, I got her pregnant. We got married, and she eventually gave me 3 children in the space of 4 years, 2 daughters and a son. It wasn't until we'd been married almost 8 years that I realized what she'd become behind my back and under my nose. It took most of my money and all of my self-respect before I was finally free of her. And even then, she left me with scars, both physical and emotional, that I still carry to this day. My name is Jason Carter, and I'm 45, far wiser than I was when I was 15. I was born and raised in a suburban area near a northern coastal town. My folks were fairly well off, and I did my best to be cool. Although I was on the football team all through high school, I didn't play much, mostly on special teams in the junior varsity. That never stopped me from smoking cigarettes or drinking beer or smoking pot. That's just the way it was in those days. You'd have thought that when a good friend of mine was killed during my senior year of high school, it would have set some of us straight, and in my case, it did for a while. I was on the rebound from that incident when I began dating Julia. We had a class together, and she sort of latched onto me as someone in need. Never mind that she already had a boyfriend, a guy who was a year older and going to the nearby community college. We started dating, and soon she left him for me. That should have been a warning, but I was so blindly in love that I failed to notice at the time. Julia was kind of a band nerd, but she was a band nerd who was open to intimacy, as they say. She was a little taller than average, fairly nice-looking, with a body that had all the parts in the right places and in the right proportions. She was always a little self-conscious about her nose, which did have a slight crook to it, although it in no way detracted from her looks. She had soft, brown hair that was utterly unremarkable. She was, for the most part, a nice girl, the youngest child of a bus driver and a school administrator. But there were a few people here and there who didn't like her much, one of whom was my father. Even before she got mixed up in drugs, Julia was very moody at times, and when she was in a bad mood, she could be difficult. But that was okay, because when I was in a bad mood, I could be pretty rough, too. Even my mom, who liked her and empathized with her, recognized the pitfalls of 2 people like us being together. I also think my dad sensed that there were dark tendencies in her soul that could devour me if they were unleashed. Plus, he thought I could do better. But I was in love. Besides, he'd supposedly married beneath his station as well, and my mother turned out to be a true princess of a person. The relationship might have run its course if I hadn't gone to college and come back for Thanksgiving break with a renewed appreciation for the wonders of weed. The first day I was back from college was on a Wednesday morning. Julia's parents were at work, and she met me at the door, still dressed in her thin nightgown. We hadn't been together in a couple of months and were intensely attracted to each other. But I talked her into throwing on some clothes and taking a ride with me. We had a quiet, secluded spot we'd used before, and I drove us there. We parked, and I pulled out a fat joint. She kind of looked at me in disapproval, but I guess she'd always been a little curious about it, based on the way I talked about it indirectly, so she agreed to try it. She got real giggly, then she turned on me with a passion I hadn't seen in her before. We had sex before, but it always seemed like she was holding something back. Not this time. She kissed me wildly, and in seconds, we were frantically ripping at each other's clothes. Having sex in the back seat of the car is not the most comfortable experience, but it was certainly an exciting one. We were covered in sweat and laughing as we slowly floated back down from an incredible high. I quickly learned that we'd had the same effect on Julia as it did on me. It made her insatiably passionate, and we had sex every chance we got that entire weekend until I left that Sunday. We spent the entire Christmas break doing pretty much the same thing, although finding the time and space to be intimate could be challenging. However, it wasn't all fun and games, and the longer the holiday break continued, the more friction there was. Julia was so passionate and fell so quickly into our routine that I wondered what she was doing when I was away at college. When we weren't getting high and being intimate, we were at odds with each other, and I think we were probably headed for a breakup when fate intervened. I'd been back at college for the spring semester about a month when Julia called me, sobbing. Her period was late, she had quietly gone to a clinic, and the doctor confirmed her worst fear: she was pregnant. Although neither of us was particularly religious, we didn't believe in abortion, and after talking it over, we decided to get married. Needless to say, both sets of parents were not happy, and my dad, in particular, begged me not to go through with it. But I felt like it was the manly, honorable thing to do, so in May 1995, we were married. Much later, after our daughter Lila was born, I worked out the timeline and realized Julia must have conceived on or around Christmas Day. I would end up doing the same calculation for our other 2 children. With a wife and a family to support, college wasn't an option, and I got a job working at a pharmacy as a stocker and sometimes cashier. I wouldn't have gotten that job under the same circumstances today because I'd have never passed a drug screen, but that wasn't standard practice back then, and I quickly showed an affinity for the work. After 2 years, I was promoted to assistant store manager at another branch in town. In 1987, Julia gave me a son, Ethan, and just a year later, we had our other daughter, Sophia. After Sophia was born, Julia decided to have her tubes tied, and we settled into the work of raising our family. Throughout this period, we partied, but nothing too wild. We'd smoke pot on a fairly regular basis and occasionally splurge on something a little harder like cocaine or hash. Julia loved the way some of the drugs made her feel, and she was always enthusiastic when we got high, especially since we'd become quite amorous afterward. But as the kids got older, the harder drugs fell away for me. With more responsibility at work, I started to distance myself from that part of my life, and I thought Julia had as well. Let me emphasize that I loved her throughout all of this, even if at times things were tense at home. But it was in the fall of 2003, when Sophia was 4 and Ethan was 5, that Julia decided to go back to work, finding a job as a receptionist for a small construction firm. At first, I didn't mind, because it meant some extra income that we needed to support our growing family. But then I began to meet some of the people she was working with, and I started getting bad vibes, especially from the men who worked there. To be blunt, a lot of them were lecherous and a few of them serious drug users. And then there was Julia's friend, Karen, who worked there and had encouraged Julia to apply for the job. Karen was married to a low-level dealer named Nathan, the person we had sometimes turned to when we wanted to score. Karen and Nathan fought constantly and were known to run around on each other. Heck, I even suspected they might be swinging, though I stayed away from that scene. Julia and Karen, however, became close friends, and we spent a lot of time at their place. The first time I really thought something might be going on with Julia was that New Year's Eve. We went to a big party at Karen and Nathan's place, and it was the usual end-of-year bash, a lot of beer and smoke. I'd been away from weed for about 6 weeks, so it hit me pretty hard. Still, I was all right until just after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I drank most of a bottle on top of a dozen or so beers, and I got sick as a dog. I remember sitting on the driveway in a drunken stupor, and it was cold out that night. Julia finally found me after I'd been outside heaving my guts out, and she brought me in and laid me on a bed where I passed out. I must have been down for a couple of hours when one of their teenage daughters found me and told me to leave her room. I staggered into the den looking for Julia, but she was nowhere in sight. I thought I heard muffled sounds of intimacy coming from one of the back bedrooms, but I was too out of it to do anything about it. The next thing I knew, it was morning. I was on the floor in their den, and Julia was asleep on the sofa. After that night, I made a vow that I was never going to do anything like that again. I had a good career going, and I could sense that things in society were moving away from the acceptance of recreational drug use. It was the "just say no" era, and as stories about the dangers of illegal drugs began to circulate, I cut back on my drinking and stopped smoking pot altogether. I quit keeping it around and slowly weaned myself off it. I really thought Julia was with me in this effort, but over time, it became clear that she had simply quit using at home. The first real sign that things were changing came in the spring. Julia went to get her hair cut one day and came back as a platinum blonde. I also noticed that she was losing some of the weight she'd put on after having the children, although I never saw her on any kind of diet or exercise plan. Along with her weight loss and new hair color, which I didn't like, she began sporting a more revealing wardrobe. When I finally complained about it, she just shrugged and said something about wanting to look good, especially at work. As spring turned to summer, she began going out with her girls from work a couple of nights a week, and she started coming in later and later. After many of her nights out, she tried to slip in quietly, lock herself in the bathroom, and shower. As she was going out more, our sex life started to fall apart. At the time, it concerned me, but later I'd be grateful. It was mid-July when she came home around 2 a.m. I pretended to be asleep as I watched her stumble in, pull her dress off, and saw to my shock that she'd been naked under her dress. That was the first concrete sign that really made me suspect she was being unfaithful. I confronted her about it the next morning, and she looked me straight in the eye and denied it. "Of course I'm not having an affair," she said indignantly. "Are you?" "Not even close," I replied, but her attitude spoke volumes. She took the offended approach, turning my suspicions against me. I knew I'd stayed faithful, even though there had been opportunities with some of the women who worked with me. But I'd avoided those temptations, knowing it would be a bad idea. Besides, I've never been great at flirting or smooth-talking women. I was in my comfort zone with Julia, and stepping out with other women would have been difficult for me. At home, our attitudes toward each other blew hot and cold, but as time went on, there was more and more disconnect between us. Our sex life was non-existent, and we didn't have the kind of playful banter we'd once enjoyed. I started to call her out whenever she'd come home a little late with the telltale bloodshot eyes and faint smell of weed. She'd turn it back on me, telling me she was old enough to do what she wanted, and that I was the one who'd started her down that road. "If you're not willing to party with me," she'd say, "I'll find someone who will." By the end of October, I made a desperate attempt to salvage our relationship. I caught Julia on a day when she had the day off and got her to sit down for a serious conversation. I told her I knew she was smoking pot more heavily than she ever had before, and I suspected she was dabbling in harder drugs as well. I asked her if she still loved me and if she still wanted to be married to me. She looked at me tearfully and said, "Yes, I do." "Okay then," I said. "I have a few conditions. I want you to quit that job and find something else. I'd like you to enter a rehab program, and we need to see a marriage counselor. I'm willing to forgive everything and start fresh, but only if you're willing to meet me halfway." "I don't know, Mark," she said slowly. "I make good money there, and I like working there. They treat me well, and I'm definitely not going into any rehab. I understand if you don't want to do it anymore, but I'm not ready to quit. I'm not an addict, I can handle it." She did agree to counseling, and we went twice, but then she decided it was a waste of time and money we didn't have, and she quit going. The pattern of her wayward behavior resumed. I started following her to the bars she'd go to after work, watching her drink with a mixed group of men and women, and some of the places she was going were pretty seedy. I never stayed long enough to see if she left with anyone because I had to get home to care for the kids. A couple of times, though, I saw her walk toward the back of the bar near the restrooms and stay back there much longer than necessary for a bathroom break. By November, I had enough circumstantial evidence to prepare for the next step and get concrete proof. Our marriage was a joke by then. We were constantly arguing, and she was coming home late from work just about every other night, looking disheveled and smelling like smoke. I was fed up with Julia and what I suspected was her pattern of lies and infidelity. Worse, she'd shirked her role as a mother, running around and partying all the time. I was doing most of the parenting because she just didn't have the time for the kids, and they'd started to notice. I needed to know what she was doing so I could plan my next move, whether there was any hope of saving our marriage or if it was time for a divorce. I took 3 important steps. First, I went to my doctor, ostensibly for a checkup, and while I was there, I asked for a blood test. I wanted to establish 2 things: that I didn't have any sexually transmitted diseases, and to show I was now drug-free. Next, I quietly got hair samples from each of our children and sent them to a DNA lab in another state. I wanted undeniable proof of my paternity for each child. DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is today, but it was sufficient to confirm whether or not I was the father. I didn't think the results would change my feelings for the kids. I was their dad regardless, but if we divorced, I planned to go for full custody, and my chances would be better if I were their biological father. Finally, I sought out the best divorce attorney in town, who recommended a private investigator. Linda Fox was a shrewd woman in her early 40s who knew everyone in town and everything about them. I told her what I wanted, and she took on my case. It was already costing me a small fortune, but I needed answers. It all came to a head on New Year's Eve. Julia's company had a custom of closing around noon on New Year's Eve and holding a big party for the employees. I figured Julia would party for a couple of hours, then come home so we could do some last-minute shopping and get the Santa presents ready for the kids to find at dawn. But 6 came and went with no sign of her. Then 9 passed. I started calling everyone I could think of: her friends, hospitals, even the local police. She was nowhere to be found. I was livid. She didn't even have the decency to curb her antics on New Year's Eve. Around 10:30, I heard a car door slam and saw my wife stumbling up the walk to the house. She saw me standing there, and her face fell. She tried to push past me, but I caught her, and I was overwhelmed by the smell coming off her. She reeked of sweat and alcohol, and her eyes were unfocused, like she'd spent hours getting high. I stared at her, and she averted her gaze. Something inside me just collapsed at that moment. I was too tired to fight her. Besides, I knew I'd soon have video evidence of her actions. I'd had a feeling she'd pull something like this, so I'd arranged for Sarah to set up surveillance. By then, Sarah had discovered that Julia had been identified as a regular at a low-end motel in a rough part of town, often accompanied by some unsavory characters. Sarah had bribed a motel clerk and had been allowed to plant a hidden camera in one of the rooms with the understanding that if Julia showed up, she'd be steered to that room. Julia and I spent a tense Christmas day circling each other, the calm before the storm. I knew Julia was off work for the next week, as her company always closed between Christmas and New Year's. I wasn't as worried about her whereabouts during that week, so I waited. Then, the day after Christmas, Sarah called me at the store. Her voice was urgent. "You need to come see the tape from the other day," she said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Worse than anything you can imagine," she replied. I'd figured Julia had a boyfriend, maybe 2, but I was not prepared at all for what I saw on Sarah's surveillance tape. Sarah sat me down in an empty office at her agency, plugged the tape into the VCR, and left me alone to watch it. The report started by chronicling Julia's behavior leading up to her arrival at the motel. Sarah's associate had managed to infiltrate the company party and provided eyewitness accounts of what went on. The party started off relatively tame, lots of drinking and some minor flirting. But an hour later, the Christmas carols on the stereo switched to dance music, and Julia was seen dirty dancing with several people, including her friend Karen. According to the report, Julia and Karen all but had sex in the middle of the room while the men surrounded them, cheering them on. After another hour, Julia and one of the men left for the parking lot, where Sarah's associate could see them smoking a joint. The men pulled out a small vial, and they shared a few lines of coke. Then, Julia's head dropped into the man's lap, and it was clear from his reaction what was happening. After a few minutes, Julia lifted her head, wiping her mouth with a sly grin, and they returned to the party. Around 5, the party broke up, but instead of coming home, Julia followed a couple of pickups to the motel where she'd been spotted before. That's where the tape began. Julia entered the room with 4 rough-looking men, all of them big and muscular. 3 joints were passed around, and everyone took a line of coke. Then they got down to business. Julia's actions on that tape put any explicit movie I'd ever heard of to shame. Her performance was beyond anything I could have imagined. I fast-forwarded through parts of the tape, trying to understand the extent of her betrayal, but I quickly became numb to further shock. The final scene showed her with all 4 men at once, but I was beyond feeling anything by then. I guess the look on my face spoke volumes, because Sarah had her associate, the one who had tailed Julia at the party, take me to a nearby bar for a drink. After a couple of beers, I felt slightly better, if only because I had a plan now. The associate, Greg, was a big, muscular guy who turned out to be a softie inside. He empathized with me deeply. He'd been through something similar and knew what I was dealing with. That night, it took all I had to be civil when I went home. Luckily, Julia made it easy for me by getting dressed up and heading out with her friends. I didn't even bother to watch her leave. I was playing with Sophia in the den when she walked out. The next morning, I went to my lawyer and told him I was ready to file for divorce. I wanted the papers ready by New Year's Eve, and I wanted Greg to be the one to serve her. I had a New Year's surprise in mind for Julia. I told her I'd be working until 9 p.m. that evening and that I'd rather spend a quiet night at home. I even asked her to stay home with me, knowing full well she wouldn't. She laughed at what she thought was my pathetic attempt to guilt-trip her into staying. "If you want to be a stick in the mud, go right ahead," she scoffed. "I'm ready to party. Can't you at least stay with the kids until I get home?" I asked, putting on my best pleading voice. "Why," she sneered. "Why should I let those little rugrats ruin my fun time? I'll get a sitter if you're too tied to that store to keep your precious babies." I was stunned by her callousness. I knew she'd lost interest in parenting, but the way she talked about our kids was colder than I'd expected. It made what I was about to do seem more justifiable. "That's fine, Julia," I replied calmly. "I'll make the arrangements. You don't have to lift a finger for them tonight." I called our teenage neighbor, Anna, who was the kids' regular babysitter, and asked her to come over for a few hours. She agreed, and I told her to call me at the store as soon as Julia left. A little after 6:30, Anna called, and I turned over the store to my assistant and headed home. I'd arranged for my brother, Chris, to meet me there to help pack up Julia's things. His wife picked him up and took the kids to spend the night at my parents' house. In just under an hour, we packed everything Julia owned into my pickup and hauled it to a storage unit I'd rented earlier. Then we drove to Karen and Nathan's, arriving a little after 10. Greg was parked a few houses down, keeping watch. "She hasn't left," he said. "Looks like she's settled in for the night." "Good," I replied, and Greg poured me a cup of coffee from his thermos. We watched as people came and went, and at midnight, as fireworks erupted around us, we moved to the door. Greg pounded on the door until someone finally opened it. The house was noisy, but eventually, someone fetched Julia. She looked wrecked when she stumbled to the door, clearly intoxicated and confused. "Yeah, what?" she started, then saw me standing there with Chris and Greg. Our expressions must have made it clear we weren't there to join the party. Greg cut her off. "Julia Sanders," he announced loudly, slapping an envelope into her hand. "You are served. This is a petition filed in civil court by Mr. Jason Carter, seeking divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. This is an injunction preventing you from coming within 1,500 feet of your former residence. This envelope contains the key and address to a storage facility where your belongings have been moved." She sputtered in shock, and I could see Karen, Nathan, and a crowd of partygoers gathering behind her. "You sorry son of a," she started, but I interrupted her calmly. "I gave you a chance, Julia. I gave you the opportunity to clean up your act, and you chose to betray me. You've made your bed, now lie in it." The crowd's murmur grew louder, but Greg stepped forward, lifting his jacket just enough to show the pistol holstered at his waist. He didn't have to do more than that. The room fell silent. We turned and walked out, hearing the door slam behind us as we left. I spent what was left of New Year's Eve with my family, preparing myself for the battle ahead. That battle came quickly. Just the next day, while we were at my parents' house, Julia broke a window in the kitchen door to get inside and apparently ransacked our bedroom. Maybe she was looking for something important, but it didn't matter. I called the police, and they charged her with breaking and entering. Because it was her first offense, her lawyer managed to get the charges dropped, but it set the tone for what would follow. A week later, I got my blood work back from the doctor and was relieved to find everything came up negative. I added those results to my growing pile of evidence. Then, a few days later, I received the DNA results. All 3 kids were mine. That solidified my decision. I was going for full custody. Julia fought me tooth and nail. For a while, it didn't make sense. She didn't seem to care about parenting, but she fought as if her life depended on it. I later realized it was more about her pride than any desire to raise the kids. She even brought up the fact that I was the one who had introduced her to drugs. But my lawyer countered with evidence that I'd been clean for over a year. With no more ammunition, Julia's case fell apart. It was October by the time things finally took a dark turn. One night as I was leaving the store, I heard footsteps behind me. I barely had time to register what was happening when I was struck hard in the ribs. I rolled out of the way just as another blow aimed for my head glanced off my shoulder. I got to my knees, bracing myself, and realized I was up against 3 attackers, 2 of whom I recognized from Sarah's tape of Julia's New Year's Eve escapades. I managed to fend off the worst of their blows, but I was overwhelmed. I don't know how much worse it would have gotten, but I vaguely remember hearing shouts from down the street, and my attackers scattered. The last thing I remember is a teenage kid leaning over me, asking if I was okay and calling for help. When I came to, I saw a woman's face, blurry at first, but as I blinked, she came into focus. She was a nurse, a pretty one with kind eyes and a warm smile. That was my first meeting with Emily Bennett, the woman who would later save me in more ways than one. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, during which time Heather became a close friend. She was gentle, kind, and had an elegance about her that was unmistakable. She was a little taller than average and slender, with soft brown hair cut just above her shoulders. She had an inner peace that seemed to radiate from her, and I found myself looking forward to her visits. As I recovered, I worked with the police, who confirmed that Julia had been behind the attack. She and her friends were arrested and charged with attempted assault. I let her sweat until the start of the following year, then approached her with a deal if she relinquished all custody claims, I'd work on getting her charges reduced to aggravated assault. She resisted at first, but when I reminded her that her accomplices had already turned on her, she finally agreed. She pled guilty to aggravated assault and went off to serve a term of 3 to 6 years. Finally, I was rid of her for good. Her absence brought a sense of relief, but it left me financially drained and emotionally exhausted. I had to sell the house and move back in with my parents to provide a stable environment for the kids. My mother was a godsend, helping care for them and doing her best to soothe their fears and anxieties. After being discharged from the hospital, I faced 2 more months of physical therapy, and during that time, I couldn't work. Thankfully, I was covered by company insurance, plus I received workers' comp, but the Christmas season had been hard without a steady income. Compared to the mess of the previous year, Christmas that year was definitely quieter, though it also reminded me of how lonely I felt. The woman I'd thought was my life partner had turned into a sworn enemy, and I was still feeling the sting of everything that had happened. In early January, I faced a new setback. The company I worked for gave me an ultimatum. I could accept a manager position in another state, or I could take a layoff. I chose neither. Instead, I tendered my resignation and found a job working on the floor of a large retail store. It was a big step down from management, and my salary was much lower, but it gave me something that mattered more at that point: time with my kids. I rented a modest house in a low-rent neighborhood, and we moved out of my parents' place. That winter of 2004 was, without a doubt, the lowest point in my life. The only positive part was my resolve to stay away from drugs and alcohol, a resolve that seeing Julia's self-destruction had solidified. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. And then an angel crossed my path for the second time. One Saturday, I was struggling to keep the kids together at the grocery store. By this time, Lila was 8, Ethan was 6, and Sophia was 5, and although they were good kids, they were still kids. I was fussing with Ethan, who was having a meltdown, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Jason Carter," she asked, and I turned around to see Heather smiling at me. She walked over, and we hugged. Then she knelt down to greet the kids, calling each of them by name. I was amazed. She'd only met them briefly when they visited me in the hospital, but she remembered them. And they immediately calmed down around her. Watching her interact with them was the first time I saw her gift with children. We chatted for a bit, and I felt her genuine concern for how I was doing. Our conversation shifted, and we just kind of looked at each other. I felt a warmth there, a connection. "Would you like to go to dinner sometime?" I asked, hesitant but hopeful. I owe you for all the care you gave me while I was in the hospital. Mark, I was just doing my job, Heather replied with a smile. But I'd love to go out with you. Any plans for tonight? I blurted out, stunned by her interest. Later, I learned that Heather was direct like that. She didn't waste time. We exchanged numbers, and she gave me a small kiss on the cheek before heading off. It was nothing huge, but it sent a wave of excitement through me. As we finished shopping, Sophia blurted out, "Is she going to be our new mommy?" "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart," I replied, laughing a little. "It's too early to say." "Would you like her to be?" I asked, looking at Lila and Ethan. "Oh yes." Sophia answered happily, and Ethan and Lila nodded. That night, I took Heather to a cozy steakhouse, not fancy, but a place with a warm atmosphere and good food. As we talked, I discovered Heather was everything Julia hadn't been. While she wasn't perfect, she had an upbeat outlook on life that was refreshing. Julia had always focused on doom and gloom, constantly worrying about things beyond her control and dwelling on past regrets. But Heather was forward-looking, well-organized, and didn't waste a moment worrying about the past unless absolutely necessary. It didn't take long for us to realize we were falling in love. After dating for about 6 weeks, I took her to meet my parents, and they were immediately impressed. My father, who hadn't been wrong about Julia, took one look at Heather and told me to do whatever it took to keep her. The kids fell in love with her too. Heather seemed to step into the role of surrogate mom as naturally as breathing. As the months passed, our relationship grew closer. We began to get intimate, but both of us were hesitant to go too far. After what I'd been through with Julia, I was cautious, and Heather was someone who took commitment seriously. "When I make love with you, I want it to be a bond of love," she told me one night, as we sat on the sofa in my house. "I gave away my virginity to a guy in college who I thought I loved, but he broke my heart. Since then, I've waited for the right man. I think you're that man, but I want us to be sure this is for the long term." "God, Heather, I do want you," I said. "You don't know how good it feels to hear you say that. After what I went through with Julia, hearing you equate love with sex is music to my ears." "Soon, my love," she whispered, then kissed me deeply. A week later, I went to my mother to tell her I was planning to propose to Heather. She did something she'd never done with Julia, likely because of the way that marriage had started. She took me to her room, opened her jewelry box, and took out her engagement ring. "Give this to her with my blessing," she said, tears in her eyes. "It's not fancy, just a small diamond in a simple setting, but there's a lot of love in this ring. I want her to have it because I think she's the best thing that's ever happened to you." I decided to propose on New Year's Eve. I wanted to keep things special, so we did Santa Claus at my parents' house, where the kids could open gifts with their cousins and grandparents. Then, after church, I took Heather back to my place. I turned on the lights of the Christmas tree and put on some holiday music, and we sat on the sofa together. I eased the box out from between the sofa cushions, where I'd hidden it. "Heather, I have a special Christmas gift for you, and I want you to open it now," I said softly, handing her the box. When she opened it, her eyes widened in surprise, and her mouth fell open in delight. "Heather, will you marry me?" Her answer was to smother me in kisses, and as our hands roamed over each other, this time we didn't stop. Our time had arrived. We made love that night, and it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Heather brought a warmth and tenderness to that moment that made me feel as though the past was finally behind me. We lay together afterward, whispering to each other, lost in the glow of the Christmas lights and the quiet of the night. As she rested in my arms, she whispered, "Merry Christmas, my love." "Merry Christmas to you, too, Heather," I replied softly. Heather and I were married in a small ceremony at her church in mid-March. My kids were overjoyed, and my parents were thrilled to welcome her into the family. We started a new life together, and Heather took to her role as stepmother effortlessly. She treated my kids as though they were her own, and they grew to love her just as much as I did. Over the years, we faced the ups and downs that come with any marriage, but Heather's calming presence brought a sense of stability to my life. She was patient, kind, and endlessly optimistic, and her love helped heal the scars left from my past. Although we tried for a child of our own, it wasn't meant to be. After several years of trying, Heather learned she had a medical condition that prevented her from carrying a pregnancy to term. It was a disappointment, but true to her character, Heather didn't dwell on it. She focused instead on helping me raise Lila, Ethan, and Sophia, pouring all her love and care into them. The only dark cloud during those years came 6 years into our marriage. I received a call from Julia, out of the blue. She sounded weak, and after a few moments of hesitation, she told me she'd contracted HIV and was in the final stages of AIDS. She'd been living on the streets, struggling with addiction, and eventually fell into sex work to support her habit. Now she was dying and wanted to see the kids one last time. As much as I dreaded the idea, I knew that closing this chapter could offer some peace to my children. The visit was difficult for everyone. Julia had changed drastically. Her once vibrant presence was now frail, gaunt, and haunted by years of hardship. The kids struggled with seeing her like that, but there was also a quiet understanding that this would be their last memory of her. Before we left, Julia asked to speak to Heather alone. I waited outside the room, trying to stay calm as I wondered what they might be talking about. When Heather came out, she had tears in her eyes, and I could tell she was deeply moved. Later, as we were driving home, she told me a little about what they'd discussed. "She told me not to let you go," Heather said, her voice soft. "She said the worst mistake she ever made was not listening to you when you tried to save the marriage. She knew you'd given her a chance to turn things around, and she regretted not taking it." That visit brought a sense of closure, not only for the kids but for me as well. Before she passed, Julia consented to let Heather formally adopt the children. For years, she had resisted it, clinging to her identity as their mother despite everything. But in her final days, she recognized Heather's role in their lives and wanted her to have that official title. With Julia gone, I was able to fully close that painful chapter of my life. Heather and I settled into a life that was fulfilling in every way. With her support, I returned to management and worked my way up the ranks. I became a regional director for the company I worked for, which provided us with a comfortable life. Heather continued her work as a nurse, specializing in pediatrics, where her compassion and warmth touched countless young lives. She had a gift for connecting with children, especially those in difficult situations. Though some of the cases she dealt with were heartbreaking, she never let it bring her down. Our children thrived under Heather's care. Lila, inspired by Heather's dedication, decided to pursue a career in nursing and followed closely in her stepmother's footsteps. Ethan joined the National Guard after high school, balancing college classes with his service. I worried as the years wore on and the potential for deployment loomed, but I supported his decision fully. Sophia, our youngest, went to college with hopes of becoming a teacher, and Heather and I couldn't have been prouder. As the years passed, we built our own family traditions, with Christmas always holding a special place in our hearts. That first Christmas together was something I would never forget, and every year since, Heather and I continued our own private celebration on New Year's Eve. After the gifts were set out and the children were asleep, we'd sit by the fire, a glass of wine in hand, and reminisce about the journey that brought us together. Now, on New Year's Eve, I look over at Heather, curled up next to me on the sofa as Bing Crosby's White Christmas plays softly in the background. The glow of the fire reflects in her eyes, and as I take her hand, I'm filled with a sense of gratitude for the life we've built together. Tomorrow, there will be laughter and excitement as we exchange gifts with our children, now adults, but tonight, in the peaceful quiet of New Year's Eve, I feel that I have received the greatest gift of all. Heather truly is my grace, my unearned gift from God. She brought light into the darkest parts of my life and helped me find love again when I thought it was impossible. I can only hope that I've shown her the same love and commitment over the years. And as I look into her eyes tonight, I know with certainty that I will love her until the end of my days. Could you forgive like Jason or move on? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories.